After they had taken Greece in May 1941, the Germans mounted a massive airborne invasion of Crete. They captured Crete, and they also took the island of Rhodes, and after that, flushed with success, they turned their eyes towards the softest spots of all in the Middle East, Syria and the Lebanon. The Syrian campaign, as it was called, started up almost immediately after Greece, and a very considerable army composed of British and Australian troops was sent up through Palestine to fight the disgusting pro-Nazi Frenchmen. Air cover for our army and navy in this campaign was to be provided by the remnants of good old 80 Squadron, and about a dozen new Hurricanes were speedily brought out from England to replace the ones lost in Greece. I began to see now why it had been important to get us pilots out of the Grecian mess alive, even without our planes. It takes longer to train a pilot than it does to build an aeroplane. 80 Squadron were to assemble at Haifa in northern Palestine in the last week of May 1941. Each pilot was told to collect his new Hurricane at Abu Suez on the Suez Canal and fly it to Haifa Aerodrome. I asked Middle East Fighter Command if someone else could fly my plane to Haifa for me, because I wanted to drive myself up there in my own motorcar. With some reluctance, Fighter Command granted my request. I loved that journey. I loved it, I think, because I had never before in my life been totally without sight of another human being for a full day and a night. Few people have. The stillness was overpowering. There was no sound at all, no voice of bird or insect anywhere. And it gave me a queer, godlike feeling to be standing there alone in such a splendid, hot, inhuman landscape, as though I were on another planet, on Jupiter or Mars, in some place more desolate still, where never would the grass grow green nor a rose bloom red. I drove on northwards across Palestine through Jerusalem and Nazareth, and in the late afternoon I skirted Mount Carmel and dropped down into the town of Haifa. The aerodrome was outside the town on the edge of the sea, and I drove my old car in triumph past the guard at the gates and parked it alongside the officers' mess. We had 9 Hurricanes at Haifa, and the same number of pilots, and in the days that followed we were kept very busy. Our main job was to protect the Navy. Our Navy had 2 large cruisers and several destroyers stationed in Haifa harbour, and every day they would sail up the coast past Tyre and Sidon to bombard the Vichy French forces in the mountains around the Damour River. And whenever our ships came out, the Germans came over to bomb them. They came from Rhodes, where they had built up a strong force of Junkers Ju-88s, and just about every day we met those Ju-88s over the fleet. They came over at 8,000 feet, and we were usually waiting for them. We would dive in amongst them, shooting at their engines and getting shot at by their front and rear gunners, and the sky was filled with bursting shells from the ships below. And when one of them exploded close to you, it made your plane jump like a stung horse. Sometimes the Vichy French Air Force joined up with the Germans. They had American Glen Martins and French Dawetines and Potez 63s, and we shot some of them down and they killed 4 of our 9 pilots. And then the Germans hit the destroyer Isis, and we spent the whole day circling above her in relays and fighting off the Ju-88s while a naval tug towed her back to Haifa. Once we went out to ground strafe some Vichy French planes on an airfield near Riyadh. And as we swept in, surprised low over the field at midday, we saw to our astonishment a bunch of girls in brightly coloured cotton dresses standing out by the planes with glasses in their hands having drinks with the French pilot. And I remember seeing bottles of wine standing on the wing of one of the planes as we went swooshing over. It was a Sunday morning, and the Frenchmen were evidently entertaining their girlfriends and showing off their aircraft to them, which was a very French thing to do in the middle of a war at the frontline aerodrome. Every one of us held our fire on that first pass over the flying field, and it was wonderfully comical to see the girls all dropping their wine glasses and galloping in their high heels for the door of the nearest building. We went round again, but But this time we were no longer a surprise, and they were ready for us with their ground defences. And I'm afraid that our chivalry resulted in damage to several of our Hurricanes, including my own. But we destroyed 5 of their planes on the ground. One morning at Haifa, the squadron leader called me aside and told me that a small satellite landing field had been prepared about 30 miles inland, behind Mount Carmel, from which the squadron could operate should our aerodrome at Haifa be bombed out. I flew off alone, and in 10 minutes I spotted a ribbon of dry earth that had been rolled out in the middle of a large field of sweet corn. To one side was a plantation of fig trees, and I could see several wooden huts among the trees. I made a landing, pulled up and switched off the engine. Suddenly, from out of the fig trees and out of the huts burst a stream of children. They surrounded my Hurricane, jumping about with excitement and shouting and laughing and pointing. There must have been 40 or 50 of them altogether. Then out came a tall, bearded man who strode among the children and ordered them to stand away from the plane. I climbed out of the cockpit, and the man came forward and shook my hand. "Welcome to our little settlement," he said, speaking with a strong German accent. "We are Jewish refugees," he said. "The children are all orphans. This is our home." The man's eyes were startlingly bright. "Is this your land?" I asked him. "Not yet," he said. "You mean you were hoping to buy it?" He looked at me in silence for a while. Then he said, "The land is at present owned by a Palestinian farmer, but he has given us permission to live here." "Then you will all become Palestinians," I said. "Or perhaps you are that already." He smiled again, presumably at the naivety of my questions. "I'm not with you at all," I said. "You have a lot to learn," he said, "but you are a good boy. You are fighting for freedom. So am I. I wish you luck." "You too," I said, and I climbed into the cockpit and started the engine. I flew back to Haifa and reported that the landing strip seemed quite serviceable and that there were lots of children for the pilots to play with should we ever have to go there. 3 days later, the Ju-88s began bombing Haifa in earnest, so we flew our Hurricanes out to the cornfield, and a large tent was put up in the fig grove for us to live in. We were only there for a few days, and we got on fine with the children. But the tall, bearded man, when confronted with so many of us, seemed to close up completely and became very distant. I'd been at Haifa for exactly 4 weeks, flying intensively every day, when suddenly I began to get the most blinding headaches. Several times it caused me to black out for seconds on end. I reported this to the squadron doctor. Not long after that, I embarked at Suez on the great French transatlantic luxury liner Île-de-France. Our convoy was continually attacked by packs of U-boats, and also by the long-range German Fokker-Wulf bombers flying out of western France. And all the servicemen on board were detailed to man machine guns. Every day for 2 weeks, I thought our ship was going to be finished off either by bombs or by torpedoes. We saw 3 other ships in the convoy going down, and after 2 more weeks at sea, on a black, wet night in early autumn, we nosed our way into Liverpool docks and tied up. I caught sight of my mother when the bus was still 100 yards away. She was standing patiently outside the gate of the cottage, waiting for the bus to come along, and for all I knew she had been standing there when the earlier bus had gone by an hour or 2 before. But what is 1 hour, or even 3 hours, when you have been waiting 3 years? I signaled the bus driver, and he stopped the bus for me right outside the cottage, and I flew down the steps of the bus, straight into the arms of the waiting mother.